Greetings, class. And in this installment, we'll be addressing the question of how does outer peace relate to conflict resolution? In a previous segment, we talked about inner peace, and that's the part that you've got going on inside of you can impact your ability to relate to conflict resolution. Now we're going to look at how the stuff out in the world can start coming into and invading our ability to make and reach and keep agreements. Outer peace, right? The peace in the world. It seems kind of intuitive that when crazy things are going on around us, it makes it harder for us to deal with tension, stress, resolve conflicts, right? It's a heightened sense of uncertainty and chaos. That means, hey, I'd like to make agreements, but since I don't actually know what the world's going to be like, right? And in some cases, the chaos is much more explicit than in other cases, right? But the outer peace, right? And just to refresh on, I'm defining the opposite of peace as injustice, right? Injustice in the world. It's not just violence, right? Because when we think of violence, we tend to think about the direct physical violence. But when we think of direct physical violence without admitting to the structures and cultures that support violence, which I would call that injustice, right? The conditions that promote violence and the conditions that permit and perpetrate differences in conditions that separate and treat people as less than they deserve to be treated. Anyway, so outer peace, right? I give the examples like, I didn't get enough sleep. I'm angry, right? My peace, my inner peace is compromised. But the conditions of the outside world make a lot of impact on the ability to make and keep agreements, right? Contracts, right? People are being forced to either terminate or cancel contracts all the time right now because there's a global pandemic. Now, I don't want to necessarily say that the pandemic is just or unjust for the sake of the example. What I'm saying is that it's the conditions of the world changing that prevent people from living up to their obligations in ways that they had intended to, right? And so this could be a source of conflict. How do you resolve a conflict where you're contractually bound to do something, but conditions, legal or not, that would prevent someone from being able to complete and live up to their obligation are interfering, right? Right. We do establish a lot of this, right? In many agreements, we have clauses that establish what will happen if somebody fails to meet obligations, or under what conditions it would be permissible, right? So this isn't a section so much on how to write up a contract or which provisions are necessary to include. It's the part where we really reflect on this detail, where the conditions that we live in, the context of society, the context of our place in history, all of those features impact people, right? And they impact people in different ways. So the outer struggle can interrupt, right, a conflict, and it can happen in two very clear ways. One is that the conflict that you're engaged in might relate to, right, the conflict between parties might be directly representative of a larger struggle that happens in society as a whole, in which case, whether or not you're responding to it and resolving it as a kind of proxy that this relates to the bigger issue or not is something that you would likely need to address. Whether or not you'd be able to is another story. But if actually the dispute between parties doesn't really directly relate to the other issues. At some level, when the outer injustice invades or interrupts, it can compromise the ability to make and reach agreements, for better and for worse, right? Um, One of the things about an absence of outer peace can very much be an individual saying, like, look, I'm not going to be able to pay you, and I'm not going to be able to pay you anytime soon because I'm not likely to have employment anytime soon, right? What does a person who owes money in the United States during a pandemic have to work with in responding to disputes as we watch the numbers of unemployed increase and hear predictions that things will still continue to get worse before they get better? If unemployment goes 20, 25, 30%, you start looking at numbers where 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 people who wants to work doesn't have a job, right? This is the conditions that I'm trying to lay out. If there is, and again, not being in peace is a challenge, right? What kind of conflict resolution can you do with someone who doesn't have the ability to act to meet the needs, whether or not they agree, right? What do you do there? If a person can't pay a debt, what happens? Right? Doesn't matter what you agree to. Person can't afford it. Do you come up with, well, how much can you afford? What payment plan could you work? And accept that despite the fact that you're owed something, you'll settle for less because something is better than nothing? I mean, that is a very important strategic moment. It's part of a calculus that a person can present in an offer from either side of the negotiation there. An affirmative declaration to the other party: I cannot pay you what I owe you. Where should we go from here? Or the affirmative declaration, right? That includes the broader circumstance. I'm unemployed. I receive, unemployment or welfare or other benefits. Maybe if the person's poor, they get benefits. Maybe they get unemployment for a certain period of time if they've been laid off of work. But the factors being presented. You trust the person. I mean, to whatever degree that the relationship allows. But the conditions of the environment and the world do not present themselves very well for resolving the dispute in terms of a way where, on paper, right? Let's just say the on paper damages, the on paper debt can be resolved. In that case, a number of different strategies could be employed. One, an agreement that we would table it or wait until the conditions changed and then address it then could be made, right? Agree to delay. Delaying can have some negative ramifications, right? The person who wants to get paid probably still wants to get paid, and delaying may not look like it's the means for getting that debt repaid. So maybe it would be a agreement to make payments, even if they were only something exceptionally modest. The parties could agree on some sort of terms with a provision that they would return to reassess down the line. Maybe it would be set in advance, like you can pay me this amount per month for 6 months, and then we'll talk about it again, about what you can afford to pay in half a year, right? Um, right. But if we take into account factors, frequently factors that are outside of parties' control, um, we we might be able to reach agreements and feel better or less betrayed by the outcomes, or what we're trying to ask for, right? I don't want you to imagine that your context should be used as some sort of like coercive tool. But if the facts are the facts, an awareness of the outer injustice or the factors that are infringing upon your outer peace, individually or collectively, um, then you can use that to identify strategies for responding or addressing, the problems. Um, this can this can relate to relationships, right? I present a lot of this as though that it's all about the substantive concern, but we have relational concerns and procedural concerns. Sometimes people just want to be heard. And if we understand the factors that are influencing some of the disputes, maybe it's time constraints. Maybe there's not time for everybody's voice to be heard. Well, what do we do there, right? What do we do if the person who most wants to be heard isn't being heard, and the other people who are being heard are people who their voice isn't the primary focus, right? We need to strategically adapt so that we're addressing all of the concerns in a way that it maximizes the good, right? Both towards the development of resolution or maybe the development of closure, right? It's one of the challenges in many peace processes and truth and reconciliation commissions. Um, it's literally impossible for everybody to voice every bit of complaint. But everybody has a story that it deserves to be heard. Um, and processing that in a way so that we maximize the amount of time for stories to be heard, but also so that we maximize the utility in the people who are presenting in a way that their needs are best met, so that the group experiences the justice that they want. It's a challenging task. How do you decide which person's story should be heard? How do you decide how many hours somebody should have for presenting their testimony? How do you, like, all of these different decisions? And a big part of that is identifying what the obstacles and impediments are, what the factors are. Right? A desire to have a process move more expeditiously because you want the peace that you believe will be inspired by the proceedings doesn't actually mean you can hurry it up, right? Some things can't be rushed. It takes as long for, something to ripen or be ready as it does. And so, again, outer peace relates in a larger sense in ways that conflict resolution is not really strategized around. We're trained to approach things from a positional and issue by issue context. But frequently, right, the overarching concerns, especially where relationships are important, are the things that if we focus on these outer conditions, these inner conditions won't even necessarily be important anymore, right? Somebody's feeling disrespected in the world, disrespected in work, then that carries over to kind of the same feeling if they feel like they're being disrespected in their relationship with you. Maybe because they see you acting in the same ways and behaviors as the rest of the world or the workplace that's causing the frustration and concern. Responding to those concerns then leads to the kind of peace over the dispute with the individual and the other party, despite the fact that the conditions of the outer world haven't changed. Just that the relationship changing so that it doesn't become analogous, right? Like I said, solving a dispute individual to individual where the two individuals are also from two different groups with prior histories and ongoing conflicts, separating, right, from this outer injustice and lack of peace, so that it doesn't become a proxy, that not all of the sins of the group are cast onto the specific individual, right? Ends up being part of maybe the strategic approach. It's hard. It's hard in the case of a lack of outer peace. It's hard to reach agreements with people when there's elevated contextual conflict, especially when there's elevated levels of violence. You can't negotiate agreements for long-term outcomes when it's questionable about any sort of even short-term survival, right? So all of these different details about reaching agreements, making agreements, keeping agreements, working with others at all, right, is something that we have to think about from both what's happening inside of me and what's happening in the world around me. And when we do those two things, it doesn't, again, it doesn't guarantee that there's any outcome that's going to be beneficial. But it does help us think through a lot more of the systematic and the structural details where we can't be strategic about employing our offers in ways where they're more likely to gain traction with others and more likely to meet the needs of the other at the same time as meeting our own needs. And when we do that, and we're thoughtful in the process, and we're thoughtful in the delivery, it increases our chances for those positive outcomes and generating mutually beneficial solutions and outcomes where mutually harming stalemates have been present. Thank you. See you in the next one.